The water had gone cold in my coffee cup before I noticed I hadn't taken a single sip. My name is Daniel Whitfield, and on the Tuesday that ended my marriage, though I didn't know it yet, I was standing in my kitchen in Asheville, watching my 7-year-old daughter color a picture of a lopsided horse, half listening to the rain against the window. Lily looked up without lifting her crayon from the page. "Daddy, why does Mommy's yoga teacher have your name?" I laughed before I understood the question. That's the part one still think about. The laugh came first, automatic, the same laugh I'd give if she'd said something about a cartoon character. "What do you mean, baby?" "Mommy's teacher, Mr. Marcus. He signed my picture Whitfield at the studio. I saw it on the wall. I'm 41 years old. I build bridges for a living. Actual bridges, steel and tension cables, things that are supposed to hold weight without anyone questioning whether they will." I had spent 11 years married to Renata, a woman I believed I understood the way I understood load calculations. Thoroughly, completely, without needing to check twice. "Maybe you misread it, sweetheart," I said, and went back to my coffee. But something had already shifted in the kitchen, some barometric pressure drop I couldn't name. Renata had been going to yoga on Tuesday and Thursday evenings for 6 years. 6 years of the same gym bag, the same lavender-scented mat rolled under her arm, the same kiss on the cheek before she backed the car out of the driveway. I had never once asked the name of her instructor. Why would I? You don't interrogate the parts of your life that work. That night, after Lily was asleep, I found myself standing in the garage, staring at Renata's yoga bag hanging on its hook like it always did. I didn't open it. I told myself there was nothing to open. I told myself a 7-year-old confusing a name on a wall meant nothing at all. I almost believed it, almost as a word I would come to hate. I went back inside and found Renata at the kitchen table, sketching a logo concept for some bakery client on her tablet, her brow furrowed in the particular way it furrowed when she was deep in work. The light from the screen caught the side of her face, and for a moment, she looked exactly like the woman I married. The same slight gap between her front teeth when she chewed her lip in concentration, the same habit of tucking her hair behind her left ear 3 times before she settled. "Lily said something funny earlier," I said, trying to make my voice light. "Something about your yoga teacher's last name." Renata didn't look up from the tablet. "Kids say weird things." She said it was Whitfield. A pause, small, almost nothing, the kind of pause you'd miss if you weren't already listening for it. Probably misheard something on a flyer. "There's a million Whitfields in this state." She smiled at me then, the smile I'd seen 1,000 times, and went back to her sketch. I told myself that was that. I told myself the matter was closed, filed away, resolved. I am good at telling myself things. It is, I would come to understand, one of my most reliable skills, and also one of my most damaging. We had a good marriage. I want to say that clearly, because everything that follows might make it sound like a lie from the beginning, and it wasn't. Renata and I met at a mutual friend's wedding in Charlotte when I was 28 and she was 25. She had worn a green dress that didn't match anyone else's idea of wedding guest etiquette, and when I told her so, she'd laughed and said she'd never been good at coloring inside other people's lines. I married that laugh 2 years later in a backyard ceremony with string lights and a borrowed sound system. For years, our life together had the kind of structural integrity I respected in my work. Load-bearing walls, properly distributed weight, nothing that should have buckled. She worked from home as a freelance graphic designer, taking on branding projects for small businesses around the city, restaurant menus, boutique logos, the occasional nonprofit rebrand that paid in gratitude more than dollars. I left every morning at 7:15 for the engineering firm downtown, where I spent my days reviewing stress tolerances and signing off on plans that other people's lives would eventually depend on without ever knowing my name. Lily had soccer on Saturdays and a loose tooth she was obsessed with losing, working it with her tongue at the dinner table until Renata told her to stop or it would never come out right. We ate dinner at 6:30 most nights, the 3 of us, and on Tuesdays and Thursdays, Renata left for yoga at 7 and came home a little after 9, smelling like sweat and the lavender oil she kept in her bag. I never asked about the studio's name. I knew, vaguely, that it was somewhere off Marymount Avenue. I knew she'd started going 6 years ago, not long after Lily turned 1, when Renata told me she needed something that was just hers. She'd said it sitting on the edge of our bed, still in her postpartum body, still adjusting to a version of herself she didn't fully recognize, and I had nodded and meant it kindly. I have always believed people need rooms in their lives that don't include me. I didn't think that made me careless. I thought it made me generous. What I didn't understand then, what I wouldn't understand for years, was that Renata had spent those early motherhood months feeling like she was disappearing. Not dramatically, not in a way she could have explained to me even if she'd tried. She told me later, in fragments, during the parts of this story that came after the part where everything broke, that she had looked in the mirror one morning when Lily was 11 months old and hadn't recognized the woman looking back. Not because she looked different, because she felt like a function, a feeder, a soother, a body that existed in service of another body's needs, and she didn't know how to find her way back to being a person with her own gravity. I want to be fair to her, even now, even after everything, because the woman I'm describing wasn't a villain waiting to reveal herself. She was someone quietly drowning in a way I never noticed, because I had built my entire approach to marriage around assuming the surface was the whole story. In the weeks after Lily's question, I noticed things I had trained myself not to notice. Renata had started doing her makeup before yoga. Not heavily, just enough that I caught myself watching her in the bathroom mirror one Thursday, applying mascara with a precision she didn't use for grocery runs. She'd started leaving 10 minutes earlier than she used to. Once, she came home and her hair, usually tied back tight for class, was loose around her shoulders, and there was a faint flush along her collarbone that I told myself was just the heat of the studio. "Good class?" I asked. "The usual," she said, and kissed my forehead, and I let the moment pass the way I let most moments pass, assuming the foundation was sound because it had always been sound before. That's the danger of trust built over years. It stops being a judgment you make and becomes a reflex you stop questioning. I told myself I'd ask about the instructor's name eventually, casually, the way you'd ask about anything unremarkable. I didn't ask. Some part of me had already started building a wall between what I suspected and what I was willing to know, brick by careful brick, and I told myself this was patience. It wasn't. It was fear wearing patience's clothes. There was a particular Thursday in late September. I remember it because Lily had a school project due and the kitchen table was covered in poster board and glitter glue. When Renata came home from class and stood in the doorway for a moment longer than usual before coming inside. She was looking at something on her phone, her thumb moving fast across the screen, and when she noticed me watching her, she slid the phone into her back pocket with a motion so practiced it didn't even register as suspicious in the moment. It was the kind of motion you only recognize as deliberate once you already know what you're looking for. "Everything okay?" I asked. "Client emergency," she said. "Logo revision. You know how they get." I knew how clients got. I had heard this excuse 100 times over the years, always delivered with the same mild irritation, always believable because it had always, as far as I knew, been true. I didn't think to wonder, that night, why a client emergency would require her to check her phone 3 more times before bed, smiling faintly each time at whatever she saw on the screen. The first real crack came on a Thursday in early October, 3 weeks after Lily's question, when Renata's phone buzzed on the kitchen counter while she was upstairs putting Lily to bed. I wasn't trying to look. I want to be honest about that, because everything after this moment depends on the audience believing I wasn't a man hunting for evidence yet. I was a man standing near a counter when a screen lit up. The notification read, "Marcus, same time Thursday? I missed you last week." I stood there for a long moment, the phone screen dimming back to black. My own reflection ghosted faintly across the glass. "I missed you last week. Not see you at class. Not, don't forget you're mad. Missed you." I didn't pick up the phone. I didn't open it. I walked into the living room and sat down and stared at a television that wasn't on. When Renata came downstairs, she found me on the couch in the dark. "You okay?" she asked, and there was something careful in her voice, something that made me wonder, only afterward, only in hindsight, whether she'd somehow sensed the shift in the air, the way animals sense weather before it arrives. "Tired," I said. "Long day at the site." I had lied to her. I want to mark that clearly, because the story I'm telling isn't one where I stood blameless on one side of a moral line. I had information and I chose silence. The same way I had chosen silence for years whenever something uncomfortable rose to the surface of our marriage. Conflict made my chest tight in a way I'd never learned to sit with. I had built an entire personality around not asking the second question, around accepting the first comfortable answer, and calling it peace. That night, I lay awake beside her, listening to her breathing slow into sleep, and I thought about Marcus's name on the wall, signed in the careful handwriting of a man my daughter had described without any sense of what she'd uncovered. Whitfield. My name. Our name. I told myself it had to be a coincidence, a common enough surname, nothing more. The next morning, I drove past the yoga studio on Marymount Avenue before work. I don't know what I expected to find at 8 in the morning. The lights were off. A handwritten sign in the window listed class times. Tuesday and Thursday evenings circled in marker, instructor name printed clearly beneath. M. Whitfield. I sat in my car for 11 minutes. I counted them on the dashboard clock because counting felt like the only thing I could control. I thought about turning the car around and driving straight home, walking in and asking Renata directly, "Who is this man, and why does he share my name? And why does it feel like my chest is full of broken glass right now?" I didn't do that. Instead, I drove to work and sat through a 9 o'clock meeting about a retaining wall project, nodding at the right moments, contributing nothing of substance, while a different structural failure assembled itself quietly in the back of my mind. Over the following 2 weeks, I became a man I didn't recognize, careful, watchful, cataloging details I would have once let pass unnoticed. I noticed Renata had started running on the treadmill in the garage more often, something she'd never been consistent about before. I noticed she'd bought a new set of workout clothes, nothing extravagant, but new, the kind of small reinvention a person makes when they want to feel different in their own skin. I noticed she laughed at her phone more than she used to. Quick private laughs she didn't explain and I didn't ask about. I also noticed myself pulling away from her in small ways. Shorter conversations at dinner, less reaching for her hand on the couch, going to bed before her more often so I wouldn't have to lie beside her and wonder. She mentioned it once, gently. "You've been distant lately. Everything okay at work?" "Just stressed," I said. "Big project." Another lie. I was becoming fluent in them. The way you become fluent in any language you're forced to speak daily. There was a particular evening, a Tuesday, one of her studio nights, when Lily and I were eating dinner alone, just the two of us, grilled cheese and tomato soup, because that was what Lily wanted and I didn't have the energy to argue. She was telling me, with the kind of meandering detail only a 7-year-old can sustain, about a girl in her class who had brought a hermit crab for show and tell, when she paused and looked at me with the unfiltered directness children have before the world teaches them to soften things. "Daddy, why do you look sad all the time now?" I told her I wasn't sad. I told her I was just tired from work. She accepted this the way children accept most adult explanations, with a shrug and a return to the hermit crab story, but something in me cracked a little wider in that moment. My daughter had noticed before I'd admitted it to myself. I was grieving something I hadn't yet confirmed was lost. I am not a man who knows how to investigate his own marriage. I build infrastructure. I don't surveil people. But grief and suspicion have a way of teaching you skills you never wanted. I started small. I told myself I was simply gathering facts the way I'd gather data before approving a structural plan. Nothing reckless, nothing accusatory, just information. I searched the studio's name online. Bloom Yoga and Movement. The website listed 3 instructors. 2 female names I didn't recognize. And Marcus Whitfield, certified in Vinyasa and Restorative Yoga, 6 years with the studio. 6 years. The same length of time Renata had been attending. I called my cousin Patrick, a man who'd gone through his own divorce 2 years earlier and had, in the ugly aftermath, learned more about background searches than any reasonable person should know. He didn't ask why I wanted to know. He just sent me a name search link and told me to be careful what I went looking for, because some doors don't close again once you open them. Marcus Whitfield, 36. No criminal record. Property records showed an apartment 15 minutes from our house. And then, the detail that turned my stomach in a way the affair itself somehow hadn't yet. A marriage license filed 8 years ago. Divorced 4 years ago. His ex-wife's maiden name, Castellano. Renata's maiden name was Castellano. I sat with that for a long time before the pieces assembled themselves into something coherent. Marcus wasn't a stranger Renata had met at a yoga studio. Marcus was her cousin Vivian's ex-husband, a connection from her own extended family, someone she would have known for years, present at Thanksgivings and christenings, and the kind of family gatherings I'd half attended and barely registered the names from. The studio wasn't a coincidence. It was a door she'd walked through because it was already familiar, already safe, already hers before it became something else. I thought back to Vivian's wedding 11 or 12 years ago, before Renata and I were even married. I remembered a tall man in a gray suit who'd made a toast about loyalty that had gotten an uncomfortable laugh from half the room because everyone already suspected the marriage wouldn't last. I hadn't paid him any attention. He was a face in a crowd of faces, someone else's husband, irrelevant to my life. He hadn't stayed irrelevant. I drove to Vivian's house on a Saturday afternoon, telling Renata I needed to pick up a tool I'd lent her husband months ago. It wasn't entirely a lie. I had lent him a circular saw, but the saw wasn't why I was there. Vivian answered the door looking surprised to see me alone. "Renata not with you?" "She's got a client call," I said. "I just wanted to grab the saw if Tom still has it." We made small talk in her doorway, and somewhere in the middle of it, with a casualness I'd rehearsed in the car, I asked, "Hey, does Marcus still teach yoga over on Marymount?" Something passed over Vivian's face, quick, almost imperceptible, gone before I could fully name it. "I think so. We don't really talk much since the divorce." A pause. "Why do you ask?" "No reason. Lily mentioned something about a yoga teacher with our last name. Small world, right?" Vivian's expression didn't change, but her hands did something. A small tightening around the door frame, knuckles going pale for just a moment. "Small world," she repeated, and there was something in her tone that didn't match her words, something that told me she knew more than she was saying, or suspected more than she wanted to admit even to herself. I left with the saw and a feeling in my stomach like the floor had tilted 3 degrees without anyone else noticing. That night, I did something I'd never done in 11 years of marriage. While Renata was in the shower, I went through her phone. I'm not proud of it. I want to say that clearly, because what I found doesn't excuse how I found it. But desperation erodes the boundaries we think are permanent. And by that point, I had crossed from a man who trusted his wife into a man who needed to know, regardless of what it cost him to find out. There wasn't much. She'd clearly deleted the more incriminating threads, but there was enough. A calendar entry, recurring, every Tuesday and Thursday at 7, labeled simply B. Not yoga, just the letter B, the first letter of Bloom, a private shorthand that had nothing to do with exercise and everything to do with concealment. A handful of texts from Marcus that had survived deletion, banal on their surface. "See you Thursday. Don't forget to bring the thing I mentioned," but loaded with an intimacy that lived in the white space between the words, in the absence of anything she'd have needed to hide if it were truly just yoga. And then, in a folder of photos labeled Work Refs, a label I would never have thought to question if I hadn't already been looking for exactly this kind of disguise. 3 photographs. Renata and Marcus. Not posed, not staged, but candid, clearly taken by someone else, clearly taken at some point in the last year. In one, they were laughing at a restaurant table, her hand resting on his forearm in a way that had nothing to do with friendship. In another, they stood close together outside what looked like the studio, her head tilted toward him, his hand at the small of her back. I sat on the edge of our bed holding her phone, listening to the water running in the next room, and I felt something inside me go very quiet and very cold. Not the explosive anger I might have expected. Something colder than that. Something that felt like watching a structure I'd spent 11 years believing was sound finally, irreversibly, give way. I put the phone back exactly where I'd found it. I didn't confront her that night. I told myself I needed more, needed to be certain, needed to understand the full shape of what I was dealing with before I said anything I couldn't take back. But the truth I wouldn't admit to myself for another several days, was that I was afraid. Afraid of the conversation. Afraid of what came after it. Afraid, somewhere beneath all the other fears, that once I said the words out loud, there would be no path back to the life I'd been quietly mourning for weeks without naming it. The following Tuesday, instead of going home after work, I drove to the strip mall on Marymount Avenue and parked across the street from Bloom Yoga and Movement, in the lot of a closed insurance office, where I could watch the studio's front door without being seen. I told myself this was the last piece I needed. I told myself after this, I would know enough to act. At 6:52, Renata's car pulled into the studio's lot. She got out, yoga mat under her arm exactly as it always was, and walked toward the entrance. A man came out to meet her at the door, tall, dark-haired, dressed in athletic clothes that looked more like a uniform than workout gear. They didn't kiss. They didn't touch in any way that would have been damning to a stranger watching from a distance. But the way they stood together, the easy familiarity of two bodies that had spent years learning each other's space, told me everything the absence of a kiss couldn't hide. I watched them go inside together. I watched the lights through the studio's front windows, shapes moving in some choreography I couldn't make out from that distance. I sat in my car for the full 2 hours of her class, and when she came out at 8:58, mat under her arm, hair slightly damp, climbing into her car and driving away exactly as she did every Tuesday and Thursday, I understood that I had just watched the architecture of my marriage from the outside, and it was nothing like what I believed it to be from within. I waited 4 more days before I said anything. I want to explain why, because it matters for understanding who I was in that moment. I am, by nature, a man who needs to see the full structural drawing before I make a decision. Every load calculated, every variable accounted for. I told myself I was protecting myself from acting rashly. In truth, I was protecting myself from the moment when the conversation would become real, when the marriage I had quietly mourned in private would have to be mourned out loud, in front of her, with no more room for the comfortable distance of not knowing. I chose a Sunday afternoon. Lily was at a birthday party 2 streets over, dropped off by Renata an hour earlier, which gave us a window of time the house had rarely held in years. Empty, quiet, no small voice to interrupt whatever was about to happen. Renata was in the kitchen when I came in, slicing vegetables for dinner, her back to me, humming something I didn't recognize. I stood in the doorway and watched her for a moment. The woman I had married, the mother of my child, the person whose breathing I had memorized over 11 years of shared nights. And I felt the cold thing in my chest settle into something hard and final. "I know about Marcus," I said. The knife stopped. She didn't turn around immediately. There was a pause, 3 or 4 seconds, long enough that I watched her shoulders rise and fall once with a breath she was clearly trying to control. When she did turn, her face wasn't what I expected. I had braced for tears, for panic, for some immediate collapse into explanation. Instead, her expression was composed, almost too composed, like someone who had rehearsed this exact moment in her mind many times and had finally arrived at the performance of it. "How did you find out?" she asked. Her voice was steady. This wasn't denial, but it wasn't confession either. It was something else, a careful first move in a conversation she intended to control from the start. "How did you find out?" wasn't the question of an innocent woman. It was the question of someone immediately trying to understand what evidence existed, what I knew and didn't know, where the boundaries of the conversation might safely sit. "Does it matter?" I said. My own voice came out flatter than I expected, colder, with none of the tremor I'd anticipated. Something in me had already moved past the need to perform my own pain. Lily saw his name on a wall. That's where it started. It didn't end there. "What exactly do you think you know?" Renata set down the knife and crossed her arms, not defensively exactly, but with the posture of someone preparing to negotiate the terms of a conversation rather than simply answer it. "I know his last name is the same as mine, which means you've been at a studio run by your cousin's ex-husband for 6 years and never once mentioned it. I know there's a photo of you with your hand on his arm at a restaurant. I know you call it yoga in a calendar entry that just says the letter B. I know I sat across the street and watched you walk into that building together on Tuesday." Each fact landed and she absorbed it without flinching, her face giving away almost nothing, though I noticed her jaw tighten slightly at the mention of the parking lot, the one piece of information she clearly hadn't anticipated. "You followed me." "Don't," I said. "Don't make this about what I did to find out. We are not doing that." She was quiet for a moment, studying me, recalibrating. "It's not what you think it is." "Then tell me what it is." "It's complicated, Daniel. It's not it's not a cheap affair, if that's what you're imagining. Marcus and I have known each other for years. We're friends. We talk. Sometimes that talking happens after class. That's not a crime." "Renata." I said her name the way you'd set down something heavy, carefully, finally. "I've been married to you for 11 years. I know what an affair sounds like when someone is trying to make it sound smaller than it is." She didn't deny the word this time. She didn't confirm it either. Instead, she shifted again, a third version of the conversation forming in real time. "You don't understand what the last few years have been like for me. You go to work. You build your bridges. You come home and you're present in the most basic ways, but you stopped really seeing me a long time ago, Daniel. I became Lily's mother and your wife, and somewhere in there I lost the part of myself that was just me. Marcus saw that part of me. He saw me when I felt invisible. I felt the pull of it. I won't pretend I didn't. There was truth buried in what she was saying. I had been the kind of husband who mistook routine for intimacy, who assumed a stable marriage required no active maintenance, who hadn't asked her how she was really doing in longer than I wanted to admit. But understanding the soil something grew in doesn't make the thing that grew there any less destructive. That doesn't answer my question, I said. Did you sleep with him? She looked at me for a long moment, and something in her expression shifted, not toward confession, but toward strategy. Why does that specific detail matter so much to you? Is that really the thing that defines what happened here? Or is it that you need a simple answer so you can file this into a category you already understand? Cheater, victim, over. Real life isn't that clean, Daniel. She hadn't answered. I noticed that immediately, the way I'd learned over the past weeks to notice every small evasion. She was redirecting, questioning my methods, introducing doubt about what the facts actually proved, keeping me slightly off balance with every response. As if the conversation itself were a structure she could redesign mid-collapse if she just kept moving the load around. I came in here with a question, I said. You haven't answered it once. Maybe the question isn't as important as you think it is. It's important to me. She studied me for a long moment, and I watched her decide something. I could see the calculation happen behind her eyes, weighing what to give me and what to withhold. Yes, she finally said, the word arriving without drama, without tears, delivered almost as if she were confirming an appointment time. For the last year, maybe longer. There it was, the number I had needed and dreaded in equal measure. A year, maybe longer. I felt something inside my chest go entirely still, the way a structure goes still in the half-second after a critical support fails, before the visible collapse begins. A year, I repeated. I'm not going to apologize in the way you want me to, she said, and her composure didn't crack, not even slightly. I'm not going to perform grief for you right now. What happened, happened. I'm not proud of it. But I'm also not going to sit here and pretend the only thing that broke this marriage was something I did on Tuesday and Thursday nights. You don't get to do that, I said, and my voice was still flat, still cold, but something underneath it had hardened into a kind of clarity I hadn't felt in weeks. You don't get to spread the blame evenly just because some of it touches me too. I wasn't a perfect husband. I know that. I withdrew. I stopped asking the right questions. But I never lied to you for a year. I never built an entire double life out of half-truths and a letter on a calendar. For the first time, something flickered across her face that looked less calculated. Not quite remorse, but something closer to recognition, as if hearing it stated plainly, without the cushioning of her own narrative, had landed differently than she expected. What happens now? She asked, and for the first time her voice had lost some of its careful control. I don't know yet, I said, but I know I'm done asking you questions you're not going to answer honestly. I turned and walked out of the kitchen. She called my name once, and I kept walking, out the front door, into the gray afternoon, leaving her standing among the half-sliced vegetables and the conversation she had tried, until the very end, to control. I didn't go far. I sat in my car in the driveway for nearly an hour, watching the neighbors' kids ride bikes in lazy circles at the end of the street, the kind of ordinary Sunday afternoon that felt obscene in its normalcy. Somewhere 2 streets over, Lily was eating birthday cake and playing some game involving a piñata, blissfully unaware that the architecture of her family had just been condemned. When I finally went back inside, Renata was sitting at the kitchen table, not crying, just staring at her hands. She looked up when I came in, and for a moment neither of us said anything. I'm not asking you to forgive me right now, she said quietly. I know that's not. I know it's too soon for that. I'm not going to forgive you today, I said. I don't know if I'm going to forgive you at all. I need you to understand that this isn't a negotiation, Renata. I'm not interested in a version of this conversation where we divide blame 50-50 and decide which parts were really my fault. That's not what I'm trying to do. It's exactly what you were trying to do 20 minutes ago. I sat down across from her, not because the anger had cooled, but because something colder and steadier had taken its place. I need a few days. I need to figure out what happens next, and I can't do that while you're trying to manage how I feel about it. She nodded slowly, and for once, she didn't argue. I stayed at Patrick's place for the next 9 days. I told Lily I had an urgent project that required travel, a lie that tasted like all the other small lies I'd told over the past month. Except this one I told to protect a 7-year-old from a truth she wasn't ready to carry. During those 9 days, I barely slept. I replayed the conversation in the kitchen on a loop, hearing Renata's careful non-answers, her redirections, the moment she finally said yes without ever once saying she was sorry in a way that felt real. I also thought about my own part in it. Not to excuse what she'd done, but because I owed myself an honest accounting. I thought about every dinner where I'd asked about her day and only half listened to the answer. Every night I'd gone to bed without asking how she was really doing, assuming that because nothing was visibly wrong, nothing was wrong at all. I had treated our marriage the way I treated a bridge that had passed its last inspection, sound until proven otherwise, requiring no further attention until something failed. Marriages, I was learning too late, need more maintenance than that. They need someone checking the joints even when nothing looks broken. On the 9th day, I called Vivian. I needed to understand more, and some part of me suspected she knew more than she'd told me on her doorstep weeks earlier. I should have said something, Vivian admitted, her voice heavy with a guilt that had clearly been sitting in her for a long time. I saw them together at a family thing 8 months ago. The way they looked at each other. I told myself it wasn't my business. I told myself I was imagining it. She paused. I'm sorry, Daniel. I really am. I didn't blame her, not really. Everyone in this story had been protecting something. Vivian, her own discomfort, Renata, her sense of self, me, my own avoidance of conflict. We had all, in our separate ways, chosen silence when honesty would have cost less in the long run. I moved back into the house, but not back into our bedroom. I took the guest room, and Renata didn't argue. We existed in a careful, civil arrangement for the next several weeks, coordinating Lily's schedule, sharing the kitchen at staggered times, speaking to each other in the flat, functional tone of two people managing a logistics problem rather than a marriage. Renata stopped going to the studio. She told me this without my asking, delivered the information flatly one evening while we did dishes side by side. I ended things with Marcus. I quit the studio. I wanted you to know that, even if it doesn't change anything for you. It doesn't, I said. Not the way you mean. She nodded and didn't push it further. Lily, in the way children sense pressure systems shifting in a house long before they understand the cause, became quieter during those weeks, asking more questions than usual at bedtime, wanting more reassurance that everything was okay. I told her things were complicated between mommy and daddy, but that we both loved her completely, which was true, and which was the only solid ground I had to offer her in a house that no longer felt structurally sound. 6 weeks after the conversation in the kitchen, Renata asked if we could talk. We sat on the back porch, the same porch where we'd spent 100 summer evenings over 11 years, and she said the words I had been waiting for without knowing I was waiting. I think I need to move out for a while. Not because I want to leave Lily. I don't, and I'll fight for as much time with her as I can get, but because I think we both need space to actually figure out what we want, instead of living in this strange holding pattern. I had expected to feel devastated by those words. Instead, I felt something closer to relief, the relief of a decision finally being made instead of endured. Okay, I said. I think that's right. She moved into a small apartment across town in December. The separation became official in January, the divorce finalized by early summer. 8 months total, faster than either of us expected, conducted with more civility than either of us thought we were capable of given what had happened. We split custody of Lily evenly, every other week, a schedule that broke my heart every time I dropped her off but that I knew, in my better moments, was right for her. I want to tell you something honest about the months that followed, because the easy version of this story would end with me as the wronged man who simply rebuilt his life in triumphant solitude, and the truth is messier than that. I grieved, not just the marriage, but the version of myself who had believed, for 11 years, that he understood the woman he loved. I went to therapy for the first time in my life, not because Renata's betrayal demanded it, but because I needed to understand my own patterns, the conflict avoidance, the way I mistook silence for peace, the way I had built an entire approach to intimacy around not asking the questions that might require an uncomfortable answer. I learned, slowly, that the marriage hadn't failed only because Renata lied. It had failed because two people had stopped actively choosing each other years before either of us admitted it. And into that quiet vacancy, she had let someone else in, and I had let distance settle into the space where curiosity used to live. Renata reached out once, nearly a year after the divorce was finalized, on an ordinary Wednesday evening when I was helping Lily with a school project about the water cycle. She asked if we could talk, and something in her voice suggested this conversation would be different from the others. "I made a mistake," she said, sitting across from me at a coffee shop neither of us had ever been to together, neutral ground chosen carefully by both of us. Not just with Marcus. With us. I think I convinced myself that what I was looking for was something Marcus could give me, when really what I needed was to feel like myself again, and I went looking for that in the wrong place instead of figuring out how to find it on my own, or with you, if you'd been willing to do that work with me. "I would have been," I said, "if you'd asked. I know that now." She looked down at her coffee, turning the cup slowly in her hands. "I'm not saying this to ask for anything back, Daniel. I know what I gave up. I just needed you to know I understand it now, in a way I didn't when we were in that kitchen." I believed her. That's the strange part. Sitting there, a year removed from the worst conversation of my life, I believed every word she said, and it changed nothing about my answer. "I'm not coming back," I said gently. "I've built something new for myself. I'm not interested in reopening a door I spent a long time learning how to close." She nodded, and there were tears in her eyes, but she didn't argue. "I understand," she said. "I think some part of me knew you'd say that. I just needed to say it out loud, for myself as much as for you." We talked a little longer, about Lily, about the practical logistics of co-parenting, about nothing in particular, and when we said goodbye in the parking lot, it felt less like an ending and more like a door quietly, finally, settling into its frame. I think about that conversation often, the way I think about a structural failure long after the repair is complete, not with the raw pain of the moment it happened, but with the steady, almost clinical clarity of understanding exactly where the load had been miscalculated. I had spent 11 years assuming a marriage, once built, required no further engineering. I understand now that every relationship is a living structure, subject to weather and time and erosion, and that the people who survive it long-term are the ones who keep checking the joints, who ask the second question even when the first answer feels comfortable enough to stop at. Lily is 8 now. She doesn't ask about Marcus anymore. She doesn't fully understand what her innocent question that rainy Tuesday set into motion, and I don't think she needs to. Not yet, maybe not ever in its full weight. What she knows is that her parents love her, that we show up for her separately but completely, and that the house she lives in now, smaller, quieter, just the two of us most weeks, is steady in a way the old house, for all its appearance of stability, never quite was. Sometimes, late at night, I think about the moment I sat in my car outside that yoga studio, watching shapes move behind lit windows, telling myself I needed one more piece of evidence before I could act. I understand now that I wasn't gathering evidence. I was delaying a reckoning I'd already, somewhere deep down, accepted as inevitable. There's a particular kind of self-deception in believing you need more proof when what you actually need is courage. I don't know if Renata and Marcus are still together. I haven't asked, and I don't think I need to know. What I know is that I am no longer the man who avoids the second question, who lets a comfortable silence stand in for genuine understanding. It cost me a marriage to learn that lesson. I would have preferred a cheaper tuition, but I paid what I paid, and I carry the lesson forward into whatever comes next. Quieter now, steadier, finally willing to ask the questions I once let pass by, simply because asking them used to frighten me more than not knowing ever did. The most painful detail in this story isn't the affair itself. It's the 6 years that preceded its discovery, 6 years during which an entire parallel relationship existed inside the structure of an ordinary Tuesday and Thursday routine, hidden not behind elaborate deception, but behind the simple fact that nobody thought to ask a basic question. Daniel didn't fail to notice his wife's affair because he was unintelligent or careless in any global sense. He failed to notice because he had built his entire model of intimacy around the absence of friction, mistaking a lack of visible conflict for the presence of genuine connection. What this story ultimately reveals is how rarely betrayal begins with the betrayal itself. Long before Marcus entered the picture in any meaningful way, Renata had already begun disappearing inside her own life, not through any single dramatic event, but through an accumulation of small erosions, the identity loss of new motherhood, the quiet resentment of feeling unseen, the slow drift of a marriage that had stopped actively choosing itself and started simply continuing by momentum. Marcus didn't create that vacancy. He walked into one that had been forming for years, in a family connection that had been hiding in plain sight the entire time, accessible precisely because it required no new explanation, no new cover story beyond a single misleading word: yoga. There's a particular kind of damage in discovering that an entire system of trust was conditional on never asking a follow-up question. Daniel's structural metaphor for his marriage, sound until proven otherwise, captures something true about how people often approach long-term relationships. We build them once, in the early years, with attention and care, and then we assume the foundation will hold indefinitely without further inspection. But relationships, unlike bridges, are not static structures. They are living systems that degrade without maintenance, that require ongoing curiosity even, especially, when nothing appears to be wrong. The accumulation of small evasions in this story is worth sitting with. Renata's calendar entry reduced to a single letter, her careful selection of which questions to answer and which to redirect during the confrontation, her insistence on contextualizing her betrayal within the broader emotional landscape of the marriage before she would confirm the simplest facts. This wasn't dishonesty in the sense of constant active lying. It was a kind of architectural dishonesty, building an entire alternate life using the existing scaffolding of an unquestioned routine, never having to construct new lies because the old, comfortable assumptions did all the necessary concealing on her behalf. What makes Daniel's response in the kitchen significant isn't that he raised his voice or demanded immediate answers. It's that his cold, controlled questioning revealed a man who had finally stopped accepting comfortable non-answers as resolution. For 11 years, he had let fine mean fine, let the usual mean nothing was unusual, let silence stand in for safety. The moment he refused to let her redirect the conversation, refused to let her spread blame evenly before she'd even confirmed the basic facts, was the moment he stopped being the conflict-avoidant man who had, in his own quiet way, contributed to the marriage's erosion. If there's a question worth sitting with after this story ends, it might be this: how many marriages exist not because two people are actively choosing each other every day, but because neither person has yet asked the question that would reveal how much distance has already grown between them? Daniel's daughter asked an innocent question about a name on a wall, and that single accidental thread, pulled by a child who understood nothing of its weight, unraveled 6 years of careful construction. Most marriages don't have a 7-year-old around to ask the question that finally breaks the silence. Most people have to find the courage to ask it themselves, long before a crisis forces the issue, or they never ask it at all, and simply live, for years or decades, inside a structure neither partner has bothered to inspect. What stays with me most about this story is how ordinary the unraveling looked from the outside. No screaming matches, no dramatic discoveries in dark parking lots, just a child's innocent comment, a man's slow, reluctant curiosity, and a woman's careful management of a truth she'd been carrying for a long time. Maybe that's the real warning here. Betrayal rarely announces itself. It hides inside routine, inside the words we stop questioning because they've always been true before. If there's a lesson worth carrying forward, it's this: the comfortable answer isn't always the honest one, and the people we love deserve more than our assumption that everything is fine simply because nothing looks broken. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do in a relationship is ask the second question, even when the first one already gave you the peace you were hoping for.